In this lecture, I'll be discussing migration in the context of human migration, and this occurs both within the countries as well as in the context of international migration. And thoughts and theories about migration, as well as political commentaries about migration, have changed quite a bit depending on the country in a historical time frame. So I'd ask you to consider in this particular time frame today in the United States, how is migration perceived? How do you perceive migration? What are the issues with migration? Indeed, we see with the era of globalization and intensification of flow, of movement of goods, of information, as well as people. And along with this, some of these things are seen as desirable or economically beneficial in terms of betterment of life, in terms of measurements along the lines of gross domestic product or overall quality of life indexes, things that you can measure such as education, educational attainment, and whatnot. At the same time, in the context of migration, there's also the notion of these unwanted flows, such as terrorism, discourses about illegality in the movements of people, and how new people arriving in an area can lead to cultural mixing and disruption of existing social systems with political ramifications for both those that have been in the area for long periods of time as well as new migrants. A form of migration that often occurs is there will be ethnic enclaves which exist in cities throughout the globe. These ethnic enclaves are sites of migration for new migrants into a given area. And oftentimes you see a lot of economic exchanges occurring within particular ethnic neighborhoods as a whole, or neighborhoods that are of individuals not only of a particular nationality, but also of a particular location within a country. For example, I had talked, I believe, earlier in the semester about my grandparents coming over from Malini, Sicily, and many of the migrants into the United States from Malini actually ended up moving to Middletown, Connecticut, and holding some of the same feasts, the Feast of St. Sebastian, in Middletown, Connecticut, to parallel what was happening in the homeland. We also talked about identity earlier in the semester and the notion of hyphenated Americans, the idea of things like Italian Americans, and when does that hyphen get dropped, and when do Italian Americans in the first generation, second generation, and typically the transition occurs in the second and third generation, where you see the movement to individuals defining themselves as Americans as a whole. So some of the big ideas in this section here on migration would be, why move? Why would individuals move? And some of this is tied up with individual agency. Of course, agency is not the same as free will. Individuals do have choice, but they have choice under rather limited circumstances. And so this calls into question some of the discussion about migration, whether it can be strictly a voluntary effort. Certainly, if we think about things like potential relocation within the United States for high-level employment opportunities, relocating to another city, for example, we might think about this as a form of voluntary relocation. However, if we think about individuals having to move out of cities and move sometimes across the United States, as we've seen historically a number of times, due to larger factors, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, these driving factors as a whole, can we say that these are truly voluntary acts, or are these more structural in nature? Two, at the international level, we see the same sort of thing. The migration, as you can see from the figure here, the migration that occurs primarily into the United States from many countries across the globe, with large numbers of individuals coming from Mexico. And not, of course, those individuals are not only from Mexico, but from much of Latin America as well. So as migration has become problematized and as there are various twists and turns with the economy as well as politics, migrants become a relatively easy political target to place blame upon in terms of things like decreased employment availability or increase in crime in a particular area. And so that raises questions about what actually should be done in order to prevent migration into an area. At the same time, in the United States, we've had historically the Bracero Project, which has brought migrants over for short-term work in the United States. And this was a rather amicable relationship between the United States federal government as well as Mexican citizens who would come and work in the United States for some of the year and then go back home after that. So the question becomes who should act and at what level, and certainly there's been quite a bit of work in terms of the state itself, in terms of the political entity that is the state, which would include the United States. There's been a lot of discussion about things like the militarization of not only the U.S.-Mexico border, but militarization in a variety of other contexts, and I'll be talking about that as we go along here. And then how are migrants perceived? How are they received in countries? And then how are they received when they head back home or they send remittances back home? In this lecture, I'll talk about the idea that we as human beings have been moving for very long periods of time. And indeed, this has defined us as a species as a whole, as our historical migrations and movement throughout the world as we populated the world. I'll discuss issues of urbanization in the megacities that have arisen and will continue to develop over the next, well, for the foreseeable future. I'll discuss the issues of remittances, that is the importance of migrants to those back home in terms of the economic resources that they provide to individuals back home. I'll draw from an ethnographic example from Kane, who did his field work looking at migrants moving into Europe as well as the United States from Senegal and how they're thought about back home and the importance of those individuals back home overall. I'll talk about the notion of forced migration. This can occur in the context of conflicts. Individuals, populations moved out of particular regions or forced out of particular regions due to violent conflict. It can also occur due to natural disasters, so displacement due to natural disasters. And of course, this is limited. This is not only limited to so-called the developing world, but also the so-called developed world. I'll talk a little bit at the end about the notion of preventing these unwanted flows in the context of migration, drawing from Anderson's work on Spain, Frontex, and Eurosur, essentially efforts to militarize the border between Europe and Africa. So it's important to keep in mind, too, that we've actually been talking about migration quite a bit over the course of the semester. From the very first week of class, very first section in class, I talked about my work along the U.S.-Mexico border and on the Tohono Nation. And on the Tohono Nation, individuals refer to migrants, illegal immigration, refer to these individuals as illegals. And I think that raises interesting questions about how people are perceived if they're identified as illegals. The relationship with the Tohono and migrants has changed fairly dramatically over the last 50 years or so, indeed over the last 100 or so years. And Kenneth Madsen, in his dissertation work on the Tohono Nation, he looks at the relations along the U.S.-Mexico border, and he points out that early on, migrants were received rather well on the nation. Individuals were seen as just passing through and attempting to make better life opportunities for both themselves as well as family members back home through remittances. Individuals would stop for a short period of time, do a little bit of work for room and board, and then they would be on their way and continue on for employment opportunities throughout the United States as a whole. Increasingly, with the militarization of the border, as well as the flow not only of people across the border, but the flow of illegal goods, primarily drugs, across the U.S.-Mexico border. We've seen increased militarization, increased distrust, as well as fear on many regions of the nation, and indeed all along the U.S.-Mexico border as a whole. So it's become a incredibly, potentially an incredibly dangerous place for individuals who it's been described in the film Crossing Arizona as a sort of a cat and mouse game between the Border Patrol or Homeland Security as well as the migrants as a whole. In the United States, too, we see the displacement, or what some have referred to as the diaspora, of individuals from New Orleans post-Katrina. And I think it's important to consider, as some authors have, the difference between passive opportunity versus paths of desperation. Indeed, individuals, as I mentioned earlier, can migrate for a variety of reasons. Some of those are voluntary and in line with new opportunities in the context of building their career. I think this is a very different sort of movement than paths of desperation, where someone's home has been decimated, has been wiped out. Someone's employment prospects have also been wiped out. Somebody's social networks in terms of organizations such as the Mardi Gras Indians in New Orleans and neighborhood self-help or community organizations for community help or assistance as a whole. All of these things have been displaced from Hurricane Katrina. And indeed, as I mentioned in the lecture, that there are potentially more there's more to lose in the context of stability, social stability, along the lines of class. So if you are in a lower class position, you have more to lose. And indeed, on the international level, too, we see that so-called less developed countries, they tend to have higher costs in terms not only of economics in relation to their overall GDP, but also in terms of the cost in terms of human life as a whole. I talked earlier in the semester too about some of my work as well as Phil Loring's work on the push-pull factors that occur within Alaska as a whole in terms of rural to urban migration. And indeed, this is something that not only occurs in Alaska but throughout the globe. It can intensify at particular periods of time, such as resource scarcity in rural regions, which essentially acts as a push factor out of these rural areas and into urban areas as a whole. I talked about climigration. We saw the film Losing Ground on Shishmaref, Alaska. Robin Bronin, who is a human rights lawyer and anthropologist in Alaska, has written fairly extensively about the human rights impacts and implications of increased sea level rise and increase in coastal erosion as a whole, and what the ramifications are and how to deal with this on an international or legal framework, suggesting a human rights framework as a whole. We talked about Bleol Butt's work on the Masai Mara Reserve in Africa, looking at the Big Five and how individuals have been displaced from livelihood opportunities. Indeed, many of the national parks that exist within the United States are the historical homelands of Native American peoples, some of which live in very close proximity to those same lands and are excluded in a variety of ways. There have been numerous attempts recently to bridge some of those gaps overall. We also see development-based displacement that occurs with large-scale infrastructure projects. The World Bank has for a long time favored these types of programs, such as large hydroelectric dams, which displace large numbers of people. We see an example on a smaller scale in the United States with the Tox Island Dam and creating what is now Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. Also in Columbia County, we see the long-term impacts of displacement of residents of Centralia for the mine fire there.